Hey there, this is Andrew, and I'm going to talk to you about how to prepare and play Adaptive KeyForge in a way that I think will help your chances of success. Um, I'll talk initially about just what Adaptive is, walk you through some of that, and then go through how to prepare and bring stuff that'll give you a good chance at winning, and follow that up with how to actually perform well during the event itself. But remember to keep it fun. I think adaptive, if you're playing full adaptive, certainly can be kind of a best of three formats are long and can be tiring, but I think can also be really fun and rewarding. So just keep that in mind, and it's not for everybody, but I really love adaptive. I think one of the reasons I love adaptive so much is that it gives opportunities to even learn something about your own decks. It gives me the opportunity to learn things about my own decks that I didn't see on my own, that maybe somebody else picks up on something interesting. And yeah, it's a lot of fun. So, okay, what is adaptive? Adaptive is a best of three format in KeyForge. By best of three, what I mean is your plan is to play 3 games, and one player or the other needs to win 2 games in order to win. Now, if they win game 1 and game 2, that's it, that's fine, it's over. But if one player wins game 1 and the other player wins game 2, then the third game will be played to determine the overall match winner. Game 1 in an adaptive match is played like solo, and I didn't say Archon solo here because you can play sealed adaptive, and I think sealed adaptive is a really fantastic way to experience and explore the game, especially when a new set comes out and you're trying to get to know new stuff, or if you were joining the game fresh. I think playing sealed adaptive would be just a fantastic way to play around and learn new things and get to see how the other person uh, interacts with those things as well. So that's why I didn't put Archon solo here, because adaptive actually works fantastic for sealed as well. But anyway, game 1 is like solo. Each person plays the deck that they brought, and then game 2 is like reversal. You play what your opponent brought. So there's a mirror fairness there, right? If you bring a better deck than me, then that gives you an advantage in game 1, but it gives me an advantage in game 2. And at that point, it's possible that one player won both games, and that person has a 2-0 record in the match. So they've won the best of 3 at that point. We don't need to play game 3. At that point, the match is over. The person who won game 1 and 2 just wins. However, if that's not the case, if the player record is 1-1, then that means that the same deck won both games. One of the decks is 2-0 and the other deck is 0-2, but the people are 1-1. So at that point, the players bid chains for the 2-0 deck, the deck that won both games. And the person who brought that deck automatically starts bidding at 0 chains. So for example, if you brought the deck that won 2-0, you would, and you're playing against me, you would start bidding 0 chains. You do not have the option to go higher than that. And then I could say, oh, I'll actually bid 3 chains. Maybe you say, well, I'll bid 5. And then if I say pass, then you would get to play your deck in game 3 that you brought, but you would start the game with 5 chains. Maybe I say, no, I'll bid 6, and then you say, okay, I pass. Well, then I would play the deck you brought in game 3. Game 3 would be a repeat of the reversal match, but with me starting with 6 chains, whatever I had bid. So, but bidding does just keep going until one person or the other passes, at which point you can start the match with the player with the higher bid, playing the 2-0 deck and starting with the chains that they bid. And those chains serve as a balancing mechanism, right? If one of us brought a deck that's much better than the other, yeah, we're probably going to go 1-1 in games 1 and 2. But in game 3, it's going to be balanced based on our evaluation of how many chains we think it's worth to bid. So it's a very player-driven balancing in that sense. Now, some people have have issues with it. It's certainly not perfect, but I think it's a pretty good system. And then the outcome of game 3 determines the match. There are some interesting notes I could put in here as far as like tiebreaker rules and blah 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 if games go to time, but this is not what I'm going to go into now. So now let me cover the big picture of adaptive strategy. These are the things we want to keep in mind as we're thinking about improving our chances of winning. The first concept that I want to claim, the first thing I want to claim is just that it's better to win 2-0. For a lot of reasons, if you can win 2-0, you're just much better off. Obviously, winning is feels nice, but when you go into that third game, there's a possibility that you take the deck for the 2-0 deck for chains, and then get a low roll, right? So that's a risk. There is one of the major criticisms that I've seen leveraged against chains as a balancing mechanism is that they can increase variance. I think Aurora is the person who has advanced that concept, and I think it's true. So, although I don't take that then to say chains are not a good balancing mechanism. I just think that is definitely an aspect of it that we have to live with. So, if you're playing with high chains, then you could get a low roll, you could get a high roll, and that could be more of a determining factor even than it would be at normal draw levels. So if you go to game 3, there's a chance that you have a chained low roll or that your opponent has a high roll. I once took a deck for 19 chains and then got Daughter in my opening hand and proceeded to win, largely because my opponent didn't have a way to deal with the Daughter for several turns. But the other thing here is if you're doing like an event, an adaptive event that can go very long, 6 rounds of adaptive can mean 18 games total. But if you cut that down to 12 by getting 2-0 wins, that gives you more time to rest, play some casual games in between or eat or whatever you need, and it's just going to decrease your mental fatigue. But remember that you don't control what your opponent brings, so you should always be prepared for going to that third game and bidding. So we do want to cover that, but it is nice if we can get a 2-0 win. And then the third concept here is don't rely on your opponent making mistakes. There are some strategies that people employ that kind of assume, okay, maybe I can get my opponent to overbid on chains or underbid or make a wrong commitment. And those are good things to try for. I mean, if you have a bidding strategy that might get your opponent to make a mistake, as long as it's within the bounds of fairness, I think that's awesome. And you might win a game based on that. But you can't rely on it. That can't be your only strategy. You have to always assume you're going to be playing people that are as smart as you, as experienced as you, and that, or even that might be smarter than you in many ways. That's again, part of what I love about this whole adaptive thing, other formats too, but especially adaptive, is oftentimes I'll be surprised by an opponent doing something I didn't think about or that teaches me. So I think that in general, if you're relying on your opponent to make a suboptimal choice in order to win, that's not good. You need to assume your opponent's going to be doing great, and you need to just outperform them. Okay, so those are kind of our general principles that we're going to be applying here. Now let's get into the nitty-gritty of selecting a deck, because some people say that selecting a deck is not important for adaptive, but I disagree, and I'm going to explain why. So the first principle that I'm going to share as far as deck choice is that you need to bring a familiar deck. You want to bring a deck that you have a lot of experience with. And I think most people do agree with this, and I'll show you. This is made up math, but bear with me here. If we imagine that I bring a deck that is at that has power level 100. I'm not using SAS here, so don't think about SAS. If I bring a deck that's like 100 points of value, and you bring a deck that's 110 points of value, but I'm more familiar with my deck, and so I'm playing it at 85% efficiency, while you're playing your better deck at 75% efficiency, then it actually comes out to I'm getting 85 points of value and you're getting 83 points of value. That's actually not a big difference. Um, so with you playing your deck at lower efficiency, even though your deck is better, that gap is significantly uh, ameliorated or abridged by me having more efficiency with my deck. Assuming I've played with it more or whatever. Um, so being confident and skilled with the deck really can compensate for difference in the deck. And then if we just assume we're each playing the other person's deck in reversal at half efficiency, well, now I have a slight advantage there, maybe even a slight advantage in in game one because I am just more experienced with my deck, and that gives me a shot at getting a 2-0 win. Now, let's assume that the values are bigger, and the difference between the decks is bigger, and your deck is 150 while mine is 100. Well, now you're going to come out ahead in game one. You have a significant advantage there, although this is only a 27 point advantage, whereas the advantage that I'm getting in reversal is a 25 point advantage. Um, so uh, so there you are. Yeah, you are getting yourself into a good situation there by bringing the better deck. But I'm making the gap smaller by having that efficiency on my own deck. It's giving me a little bit of a chance. Um, and that affects one way I think about this is if we imagine that 5 points is worth one chain, which it's not, that's not right, but if we just imagine there's some ratio between chains and points here, then then playing in reversal, I have a 25 point advantage, which means I could take your deck for 5 chains and have the game be even, and you have a 27 point advantage, which in solo, which would mean that you could take the deck for 5, maybe 6 chains. Well, that gives a pretty tight spread. Whereas if if I had lower efficiency here, that would mean that you ultimately could go higher on the chains to take your deck. But if we have it in that tight range of, I could take your deck for 5, you could take your deck for 5 or 6, then that actually puts me in reasonable position for bidding chains. So anyway, it's always better to just increase this number. Um, if you can get up to 90, 95, 100, obviously there's no real exact way to measure this, but I certainly think there are decks out there that are getting played way under what they could do because people haven't spent the time on them. So anyway, bringing a deck that you're familiar with, that you have a lot of reps with, increases your skill multiplier. We'll call this in the math. Okay, bring a weird deck. Um, so this is, I think this is one of the really important things about deck selection, and I don't think this is very controversial either. I've never had anybody argue very strongly about this, but I will refer back to that. Don't expect your opponent, don't bank on your opponent making mistakes. You can bring a weird deck and still have your opponent know how to play it well. And I'll talk even about how you can increase your chances of playing your opponent's weird deck well. But I do think by bringing a weird deck, you increase the chances that someone will make a misplay. So there's a couple concepts here about bringing a weird deck. One, or things that I could mean here by bringing a weird deck. One is um, bringing a deck that just plays differently than people are used to. So I had a deck that I was using for Adaptive for a while that is very good. Its SAS rating is very high. It's 89 SAS, but with only 9.5 expected amber. And so that really low expected amber, it has some 7 pips and just needs to have creatures on the board and reap, and it has ways to do that, but it certainly doesn't autopilot. It does not play itself. So you have to really think about what turns you're taking. There's often times that you have like 2 or even 3 good options for houses, and you have to choose which is the best option to maximize. Um, and that's hard because people are not used to having so much decision space, and some people are not used to, for example, having a REIT-based engine. So that could throw some people off. I also think you can get a lot of value out of bringing weird cards. So cards like Soul Snatcher really change the math in the game. Um, Crassosaurus is a card that in most decks that it's in is bad, but if you have a deck where it's good, then people sometimes struggle to realize that it's good. May even discard it where they should have kept it or something like that. So um, Crassosaurus, I think, can be a really good one. There are others too that aren't on here. Curiosaurus really makes people have to think in ways that they don't necessarily want to. And so when people are playing, when you're in the reversal match or the reversal game, people may discard or play these cards when they shouldn't, when they should have done the other. And so playing cards that are just a little weird to people. Sometimes I think bringing a set that people aren't used to playing, like a lot of people who are used to playing Archon solo, maybe don't have a good AOA deck, and so bringing a deck from set 2, Age of Ascension, that has cards that they haven't played with a lot, could also just throw people off. So there are a number of ways to do this, but I think having cards that people aren't used to is really helpful. Whirlpool also just really changes things, and there are some decks with Whirlpool that shouldn't play it, so, or it can be very matchup dependent. So all these are cards that just make people think harder, increase what's going on, increase the size of what's going on and what people have to keep track of, and those are really good for opening up opportunities for an opponent to make a mistake. Yeah, so I think bring a weird deck, and then this is the one that I've had some people push back on, but I really this is the if I leave any mark on competitive KeyForge strategy theory, maybe it'll be this, that I think in adaptive you are better off if you bring a good deck. And one principle there I'll say is it's better to win game 1 than to win game 2 if you're only going to win one of those. But let me show you the math here. So we showed you situations where maybe your opponent brings a better deck than you. But here's an example where, if I bring the better deck, let's say I bring by far the better deck. Obviously, it's going to be pretty hard for me to lose game 1 here, and it's going to be pretty hard for me to win game 2. But I get a couple of advantages going into game 3. One is that I get to choose whether I go first or second, and usually in adaptive you want to go first to maximize shedding chains. So I get to choose to go first, which means I can afford probably a free chain. But additionally, if you look at the differences here in these numbers, in the solo game, I have a 75-point advantage, whereas in the reversal game, my opponent only has a 50-point advantage. So again, if we're assuming that a chain is worth 5 points, then that means that my opponent can afford to bid 10 chains, while I can afford to bid 15. But if I know this, I don't need to actually bid 15. I probably am okay bidding 11, because if I bid 11, well, my opponent doesn't want to go to 12 because they can really only afford 10. So they probably let me have it at 11, which means that I now have a 20-point advantage, even with chains. Or maybe my opponent goes to 12. Well, that means that I have a 20-point advantage, or sorry, a 10-point advantage, if I let them have my deck at 12 chains. maybe they go to 14, so, but it gives a space in which if I'm bidding in this space 11 to 14, um, if I'm bidding 14 or below, then I get an advantage. If my opponent takes it for more than 10, then I have an advantage, and that just puts you in a really strong position for bidding because you're going to come out ahead one way or the other. Now that's assuming that we had like arbitrary or objective ways to say exactly how many chains is good for a player, but the overall point I'm making is just that by having the better deck, you create a space, however wide it ends up being, where you can afford to go and your opponent can't. Um, yeah, so I think that's my math there. Okay, now we talked about by bringing a familiar deck, you increase your chance of having a good multiplier in for skill in the Archon game. And we also talked about bringing a weird deck, which I would say increases the chance that your opponent will have a low skill multiplier in the reversal game. But there are some things you can do beyond that. And this is once you've chosen the deck, you want to get a lot of decks of reps in, obviously, and that will again help you increase that your skill multiplier in the in the solo game. In sealed adaptive, that's not possible, but in Archon adaptive, it is, and you should do it. You also should consider getting some reps in some games in with chains and bidding. You should consider doing some short adaptive practice on the Crucible. This is a way you can choose adaptive as a format, adaptive best of one. In adaptive best of one, each player, instead of normal adaptive where um, the players are bidding for the deck that won the first two games, in short adaptive, the players each pick which deck they want. And if they chose differently, then they each get the deck they chose. But if they choose the same deck, then bidding happens as it would if that deck had won games 1 and 2. So it's a way to get game 3 practice in, practice bidding, practice playing with chains. You get an idea for some decks might play really well at 0 chains, but have really drop off quickly as the number of chains goes up, where some decks might play under chains better than others. So this is a really good way to get some practice in there. And that will just increase your chances of knowing how to bid well. And then the last tip I have here is to get in reps with a variety of deck archetypes, because this makes you more resilient against your opponent bringing a weird deck, and increases your chances of having a good skill multiplier in the reversal game. If your opponent brings, in this case, in this example, we're back to you're bringing a much better deck than your opponent. If you have just more ability to adapt to, which is the name of the format, right? Adaptive, to adapt to a weird deck than they do, then maybe you're getting much more value out of the deck, and and bridging that gap. And this is a great situation, right? If we can, if by player skill, we can increase our chances of winning that reversal game, even though one deck is much better than the other, then that's a really good thing. That's going to increase our chances of getting a 2-0 win. And of course, that also gives us more flexibility when we're bidding chains. So it's just good all around. Having reps with a variety of deck archetypes is pretty important. And I have a series that talks about some deck archetypes. It's not comprehensive. It doesn't cover everything, but that could be a good way to get some thoughts about deck archetypes. But I don't think there's any real substitute for just getting out there and trying lots of different things. All right. One thing I wanted to just cover back on the idea of bringing a good deck. I have heard people multiple times push the strategy of bringing a very bad deck. to make sure that the game will go to game three, and then just bid for the other person's deck on yeah, just bid for the other person's deck. And I think the risk again is it just puts you in a situation where if you're the person with the lower chain threshold because of not being a deck that you haven't gotten reps in with their deck, then it can put you at a disadvantage. And one theory that a good player I know has pushed is the idea of, well, yeah, but I'll bring a deck that maybe has high efficiency but just doesn't do a lot. Um, and that could trick the opponent into thinking it's better than it really is, and letting me have their deck for too few chains or something like that. And but I'll just refer back to, I don't think that counting on your opponent making a mistake is a good long-term strategy. Okay. Okay, when you're actually playing in games one and two, you need to pay attention. Look for your opponent doing interesting things that you could use in game two. Game one should really be helping you prepare for game two so that you have a chance to really maximize your use of their deck. And then note not just which deck won, but how much it won by, because that could really matter in bidding. If a deck really trounces the other deck, then maybe it's worth bidding more chains for that. Whereas if it was very close, maybe you don't want to bid many chains. Um, I'll talk a little bit more about this and reference really what I think is the gold standard on explaining this idea, but it really does pay to notice how big of a difference the outcome was. One other thing that I didn't put in the slide but thought of is that sometimes there are decks where in a particular matchup um, you could play it 10 times and all 10 games uh, one deck will get to 2 keys and be threatening key 3, and the other deck will win. And it's good to think about that too, because um, getting to check on key 3 is very different from getting key 3, and there really are situations where uh, one deck might seem very close, but it will never get over the threshold, or it'll almost never get over the threshold. But that's a little more advanced, difficult to think about, so don't stress out about it. But maybe as you get more experience, it's a good thing to think about. Okay, and then I would also say you need to keep a cool head. In adaptive, it's very common to end up 1-1. And the one possible disadvantage of bringing the better deck, winning game one and then losing game two, is that it could put you in a funk going into game three, and you really don't want that. So I would say, as much if you get the opportunity, play a lot of best of three setups and get used to the idea of getting a loss, having a low roll, and still keeping your head in the game. Okay, and then let's talk about when it's time to bid. I'll include a link to this, but Jason from Team Reapout wrote a really great article a long time ago explaining a chain bidding strategy based on the amber delta from game one and two. And it won't always get you to the right answer, but it's a very, very good starting point. And I don't think he would claim that it will always get you to the right answer, but it is a very, very good starting point. And so I'll link to that, and I really highly recommend reading it and trying it out a few times. I do not actually count amber that way, but I did for a while, and it was very good practice, and it helped me get a good feel for adaptive. So I really, really strongly recommend that article. And then I would say if you can think about whether each deck's performance was normal or it was out of range, that's going to be helpful. I had one matchup in an event where I was playing my deck that really likes to reap, and my opponent was playing a lower SAS Brobnar deck that just controlled the board and made it very difficult. And so He won game one, and then uh, partially because I low rolled, um, and I recognized I kind of low rolled. I think he might have high rolled, and he won game one, and then game two was very difficult. I barely eked out a win. Um, that I think was mostly attributable to him not. He played my deck fine, but I don't think he played it as efficiently as I would have, and um, and I'm sure I didn't play his deck as efficiently as he would have, but still, I was able to make up for it and win game two. And at the end of that, I thought, I think that actually my deck I should has a better chance of winning, and so I let him have the deck that had just gone 2-0 for zero chains and proceeded to win game three. Um, that's a really extreme circumstance, but uh, I made that decision based off of um, actually I think that there was there was a low roll situation in game one, and uh, and I think that that's not normal. So anyway, that's just the kind of a next level to think about. And then also it's worth realizing if there's any chain mitigation in the deck that you're bidding chains on. If it has, three daughters or something like that, then it might just get to the point very quickly where the chains don't matter as much, and you need to worry about that. Uh, and in the losing deck, there could be some chain punishing effects. Binding Irons is the obvious one. Less obvious is if it's a Dark Tidings deck that really wants to keep the tide high and might entice the opponent to want to lower the tide. If they already have chains, that's going to be tougher on them. So then they kind of end up having to choose to either slow their deck down further or let you continue getting your Mecha Buoy money or whatever. So that's something to think about as well. Um, all right. So that I think oh yeah, last thing. Yeah, I think this is actually important. And this I got from well, I think I kind of did it already, but really had this idea bolstered in my mind by reading a book on negotiation. Um, Sometimes jumping numbers can uh, throw somebody off a little bit, and you can get them to pass on a lower number than maybe they would have already. So I've heard some people say you should always just bid 1-1-1-1-1-1-1, because if your opponent is only willing to go to 7 and you're willing to go to 10, you don't want to bid 9, right? Um, you could have bid 8, and so why risk going higher than you needed to? And I think there's some validity to that thought. You definitely don't want to overbid, but at the same time, sometimes there are people who are thinking that way, and if you jump straight to 5, they might say, "Oh, okay, you can have it." Whereas if they really had, if you'd gone by ones, they would have worked up to 7 or something. So it's just worth considering skipping numbers. Your mileage may vary, but I think try it out sometime. And just being the person pushing out confidence can give you a little bit of a boost, I think, sometimes. So, and I think you got to be careful about that. Like, you don't want it to go into territory of being a bully or trying to intimidate other people. But I think bidding is a mechanism here, and being bold is not the same as being a bully or intimidating. So there you go. Okay, so that's all my advice, except the last thing I'll say is don't forget to have fun. Remember, in any sort of best of 3 format, it really can start to feel like a slog. If you're not having fun, do something else. If But I think if you can think about even the losses that we all inevitably get as opportunities to learn and grow, then it can stay very, very fun. I hope you enjoy. I hope this helps you out and that you'll get out there and forge some keys.